Great. So my name is Kevin Smith. I am from Personal Finance Lab, Stock-Trak, How the Market Works. We use the terms differently depending where we are. My background is I have a master's degree in economics. I specialize in game theory. I did a lot of research, I should say, on incentives, especially when it comes to high school undergraduate students, how they make decisions, how the learning process works. And I've kind of been working with Personal Finance Lab for the last 6 years on putting a lot of that into practice when we're building up resources and stuff for personal finance and business classes. So what I'm going to talk about, kind of in order, what it means to gamify is actually going to be probably the bulk of what I'm going to talk about today, because this is kind of the heart of the matter, and it's very important. And the more I talk with teachers and the more I read about what else is going on in this space, the more disconnect I see there has become between what the research really says and how this is getting applied in classrooms. So that's going to be probably the most important thing I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means with distance learning, which is something that is becoming very thematic lately, but gamification is more important than ever when we talk about distance learning initiatives. And then I'm going to get into what we as a company are doing about it, what we recommend for schools, whether they use our stuff or not, how you can put this stuff into practice with your classroom, and some of the general best practices of how it works. So I am going to do the worst thing that I hate in every presentation, but in this case I kind of have to, which is defining the term before I get started. Because this is kind of where the disconnect really comes from when we talk about gamification and what's happening in classrooms. A game is not an activity that you go on and you find and have your students play in class. It's not a board game. It's not when you have your students go online to a resource and play a game on the internet that has an educational component. A game just means a structured form of play. And play doesn't mean something that's fun. It just means it's a range of intrinsically motivated activities. So what that means is when you're talking about a game or gamification, what you're talking about is setting up a structure in your classroom or in your environment where you have certain incentives put in place where students are going to be almost naturally inclined to work towards those goals. If you have a game set up properly, you don't have to force things along. You kind of set the ground rules, and then the students should have, I won't say sufficient, but they're going to have significant push to go towards those objectives. Basically, setting up the game rules means defining the win state. What does it mean? What is it that you want your students to do? What are the actual objectives? What are the rules that they need to go through it, and showing clear progression towards that goal. It doesn't mean it's fun. It just means it's engaging. And the key there is that those are two different things. So when I'm talking about gamification on the whole, I'm talking about engagement more than just something that's fun. If you're looking at what makes a bad game, and I will talk about bad games, and I will use exclusively examples that I personally have been involved with, is that the biggest thing you have is bad rules and bad ways that the incentives are communicated to the students. Either the games are set up so they're not going towards the goal that you're trying to achieve, or that the win state isn't well defined to begin with, where students are playing a game but they don't really see how it builds up to what they're supposed to be doing or learning, or what you want out of them. And if you have a bad game, or if you have a game that works really well as a game in and of itself but doesn't lead to those larger goals, that's how you get the drop off in engagement, and that's what we want to avoid. So starting out, first lesson to take away from this, like it or not, your class is a game. Your class is already gamified. Everything that is in a game is in a classroom. Summative assessments define the win state. How are you evaluating your students? And those are the objectives that should be set forth in crystal clear terms, and that's what they're working for. Your formative assessments, your assignments, all the other activities that you have throughout the game define the incentive structure that you are giving your students to achieve that final win state. You're giving them the breadcrumbs to follow to build up to that ending point. So this is what we call game thinking rather than gamification, where when you're setting up your class in the beginning, it shouldn't necessarily be what games do I want to add to my class to make it more engaging. It's how do I make my class itself gamified, have the objective breadcrumbs laid out so the students are all consistently working towards that win state. Which was a bit much to go in technical terms, but I'll break it down a little bit to make it more applicable. So, as I just said, gamification means bringing elements of games, particularly video games, to other activities. This term really started to take off about 10 years ago. Some of the first gamification platforms came into being, where they tried to take things like points and badges and stuff and add it to basically everything else in the world because they thought just having points and things would make users more engaged. Our company did that too, and it fell flat in its face, and I can tell you exactly why that happened because I came into the company after that was done. But many of the early attempts failed, not because they were missing some essential element for the gamification, but because they were trying to make something not fun. They just thought by adding elements and points and things that it would just help that happen, but that's not the case. So gamification starts with understanding what your class objectives are, choosing your activities that directly align with those objectives, building the small milestones for students to strive for to get the bigger ones, and giving the students instant, clear feedback about how they're progressing on each activity, both in the activity itself and how and why this activity applies to the larger goals. When I was in school, a lot of my classmates really loved movie days, and most students do because it kind of gives them a break. But at the end of the day, if you're not very careful with using movies and games and other kind of breaks in the class to make sure that they 100% go back to the themes of the classroom, all they really do is break the engagement you had the students throughout the semester in exchange for a short-term activity they're enjoying a little bit more. That's not really great for the learning objectives. So what I want to talk about right now is Wall Street Survivor. Wall Street Survivor is another one of our websites. Instead of an educational resource for classrooms, it's for individuals. It's its own stock market game. And this is until about 10 years ago where a lot of our focus went when it came to trying to drive engagement. Now, Wall Street Survivor is an ad-based website, and it has a stock market game, and it has a couple things with content and lessons. It's geared towards the general public. So because it's powered by ads, our company wanted to drive more user engagement to get more page views, and that means we wanted to have the users who were already engaged in the stock game, which means they had joined a stock contest, they were building a portfolio, and they had rankings they were comparing, and that was the game they were playing, and we wanted them to get a little bit more involved in the content that we had. To do that, we started offering badges and points. So all of these badges you see back here are actually badges we had originally designed for the Wall Street Survivor site probably 10 years ago. So what happened here is that we did all this work and we put all these badges in and we thought we had a completely gamified platform, and we were actually used when we launched as an example of gamification done right, because it was supposed to be all stuff that would help people learn, understand more about the economy, investing, and it was kind of a poster child for things done well. But at the end of the day, when we actually looked at the results at the end of the exercise, it was pretty much a complete and total failure. And I like talking about this with teachers because this is exactly how gamification in the classroom can fall on its face. The first points of failure that we had is that we did not align our objectives with what we were doing in the gamification. So everybody who was there to begin with was there for the stock game. They were being invited by their friends to build a portfolio and trade stocks and do all the things. That's the game the students were trying to play. Or not the students, the users are trying to play. That's what they were there for. That was the overall objective. But the way they were earning these badges was mostly dealing with our content and other lessons that had nothing to do with what they originally came there for. So just because we wanted them to do something else that we thought was important, they didn't get the connection between the two. And the second point of failure is that we didn't align our incentives. So besides these users getting a badge that shows up in their portfolio, they didn't really do anything. There was no rewards that they got that they could show anybody. They couldn't show them on the rankings page or anything else. The win state of the stock game is the rankings. It's moving up on the rankings page. It's a social statement about how you're comparing against everybody else you're competing against. Going up and down isn't necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but it shows where you stand. So when we did all these badges and we didn't tie it to that social aspect that the users were there for to begin with, it had no impact. I wouldn't say the badges hurt anything we did, but we didn't get any increased engagement. It didn't really make anybody happier than they were already. It didn't make anybody more engaged than they were already. It didn't make them learn any more than they were already. We did see a lot of people clicking through our lessons very quickly just to get the badge at the end, but they weren't learning anything by doing it. So from my perspective, I would consider that a failure. So that goes back to what it means to gamify properly. And this is what it means really in your classroom. It's about providing long-term constructive incentives. It's not about necessarily adding game points or gold stars. All of those things do help, though. They're all parts of what build together for it. What it really means is that every activity in your class has to give students some form of personalized, as real-time as possible feedback that they can act on, that they can improve on, and making sure that they understand the feedback they're getting and the activity you ask them to do goes back to those higher level class objectives. Which means you should be very wary of fun activities or stuff you think your students are just going to enjoy but don't necessarily have that clear progression. Or busy work. The busy work is the worst possible thing you can do to keep your students engaged. They have to see how everything you're asking them to do goes back to that longer term goal. If you're gamifying everything else but then you start adding in extra stuff to keep the students busy, that's going to break down the engagement pretty quickly. They need to see little steps adding together. They need to see how the rules of the game are established. That way the play mechanism can take over and they can start learning without necessarily having to push them every step of the way. If the students see the finish line as the goal, as the end of the semester, just trying to run out the clock, then gamification kind of failed. You want them to see the win state of the game as what they're working towards. Which means what really helps for all of this is an actual tangible aspect of every game that works in a classroom that every teacher should keep in mind. And it might be one of the last things you would expect, but it is the mighty progress bar. When it comes to building games for schools and games for anything else, if you want to give the students the sense of progression, show them the sense of progression. Say that by completing this activity, it's bringing you this much closer to the end goal. That way they connect the activity, the goal, their actions, their feedback, and everything else together to show they're moving forward. If they don't feel like they're moving forward, if they feel like the only way they're moving forward is literally time passing and getting them closer to the end of the semester, then the engagement is going to be nearly zero. So in every aspect of that you're trying to do, think of it like the students are filling up the progress bar from 0 to 100%. 100% doesn't need to be, and it really should not be, the last day of the semester. The 100% is the student understands all of the major themes and objectives of the course. And they should see clear block progress as they get closer to those objectives. And the smaller you can break down the percentages, the better. So they can see each individual activity and task is filling up that progress bar a little bit more and more. Now, this gets back to the second part, now that I've talked a little bit about what it means to gamify, and it's not just using games, it's the incentive structure. It gets back to why this matters with an actual distance learning platform like most schools are kind of forced into right now. It's a new challenge. It's not for me. I have been working from home for about 5 years now, and everything we do is online, so I mostly work with schools that try to use a lot of our stuff at home to begin with. But the name of the game is engagement. The hardest part of a lot of teachers transitioning to an online platform at any given time is the engagement. And I know that I take night classes and the professors I work really struggle with it. They have no idea what to do when the students aren't sitting there right in front of them in the classroom. But the gamification in a well-gamified classroom is exactly how this is addressed. And as far as I can tell, it's really the only way to do it. It's nearly impossible to keep the students' attention if you can't actually have them physically in the room, unless you can have that incentive structure in your classroom where they're getting the constant feedback, they're seeing how what they're doing is building up. So what that really means is when you're looking at a distance learning platform or a different distance learning classroom, is using games, activities, and lessons, ideally as little lecture time as possible, but making sure that when you sit down to build it, they all are going directly towards the course objectives. They're not tangibly related. They're not something you thought was interesting that kind of goes along with it. You have to make sure that the stuff you're choosing and the formative assessments that you put along with each activity show the students how it leads up to that long-term end goal. So use as much real-time progress as you possibly can. That real-time feedback, that instant feedback, as soon as a student sees something they did, causes that progress bar to go up another little couple ticks. That is where you get the biggest benefit in terms of school engagement and the students really staying on top of what you're asking them to do. The next biggest thing is long-term activities. Trying to chain together one day at a time it works for a little while, but eventually the engagement really drops off. As much as you can, you're going to want to have activities, games, lessons, whatever, that span multiple weeks, where you can kind of rejigger the lessons or the activities so they work with multiple topics. That way the students can keep relating the new stuff you're talking about to the activities they were doing before and seeing how they're interrelated. But even with long-term activities, it's very important to break them down into digestible milestones. So I talked about a lot of stuff really fast there, but the whole point is having consistency, especially consistency in your incentives, and building up to something. Students should always feel like the class is building up to something and they are building up along with it. So just remember that with distance learning, the maintaining the extremely clear learning objectives is more important than ever. The second the student doesn't know exactly what they're supposed to be learning, they don't understand what the theme that they're getting at is, you're not going to be able to keep their attention. It's already gone. Second, gamifying your classroom is not just driving student engagement, because that's kind of how you get lost with all the other games and activities that are only kind of tangibly related. Just because the students are a little bit engaged one day and they're having fun one day doesn't mean that it's building up to a really gamified classroom. It's just as much an exercise for the teacher, where you spend the time making sure that the stuff, every little action, every milestone you have in the classroom has a direct traceable chain that goes back to the end win state that you want the students to be striving for. And they need to have something to strive for, because that's what keeps them engaged to begin with. Which goes back to what I've said several times, incentives, incentives, incentives. It is every minute the student is spending in your class, they should be having an incentive that is kind of subconsciously or consciously telling them what they should be doing, what the objectives are, and allowing them ideally to use a little bit of creativity to reach them. Because all of those things together means that you don't need to be sitting over their shoulder. They should have a little bit of push on their own to get through what you're trying to get through. Which transitions to our company and what we're doing about it. So actually, before I get into the next part, I did include a packet that I sent out with the with this presentation. It was a Google Drive thing at the beginning, and there was a couple of links in there. In the first section, there's what it means to gamify. There's an article on bulletin.com about game thinking versus gamification. And when you're talking about, and when you're thinking about how you're going to be choosing the resources that you use in your class and thinking about the kinds of things you want to run in your class, it's an extremely good article about what it means to do game thinking, what it means to have these incentives line up, how you start with the objectives and then you work backwards through adding in game elements rather than thinking about, I already have my class, what game elements can I add to it? So making everything work together in a very smooth environment is a really important key to all of it. Then I'm going to get into what we're doing about it. So our company is personalfinancelab.com. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we do games online for personal finance, business, and economics classes. Our two stars of the show are LongTerm Games. We have a budget game. A budget game gives your students the role of a college student with a part-time job. They get variable income. They have all kinds of unexpected expenses, and the students need to progress through the game according to the settings the teacher set up. So it's a long-term game, meaning that every month of the game takes about 10 to 20 minutes for the students to complete, and the teachers say how many months they want the game to go for the duration of their class. Most teachers go for about a year, so 12 months. It takes about 4 to 5 hours. But we also have other teachers that extend it out a little bit longer and shorten it a little bit to however they want to do their class. I would say 12 months and 24 months is the most common two settings. The other one we have is our customizable stock game, real-time stock game. It works together with the budgeting game too. For this one, I think most teachers in here have used a stock game before, so I'm not going to go into that in exhaustive detail. But you can choose the length of that as well. We always say the longer the better. The more exposure you give your class to the actual markets, the more effective the stock game will be to teaching every aspect of what your class is trying to cover. Usually 10 plus weeks is what we recommend, but even shorter 2-week games, just so students get a chance to dip their toes into it, works pretty well, just both for engagement for the class rankings and so they understand what you're actually talking about. So with the budgeting game and how this relates to what I'm talking about here is that we have the game structured so the entire duration of what the students are going through is basically a lesson in pay yourself first. Students get the most points in the budgeting game by using a pay yourself first saving strategy where they save 10% of their income from every paycheck right away. That breaks them out of the habit of seeing their income and expenses. This is a screen on the game that we show where they have their income, expenses, surplus, or shortfall. And we would say, pretty much ignore your surplus and shortfall, ignore your expenses. You can change those later if you need to. As what we're trying to teach, it's pay yourself first. Your savings should be based on your income alone, and you'll have to change your expenses to match that later. But throughout the entire game, instead of it just being an exercise of repeating the same actions over and over again, we add in lots of little mini lessons. So this one here is needs versus wants. Students will get this card in the game a couple days in, and they need to complete a short lesson on needs and wants before they can progress. Each little mini lesson talks about a concept in personal finance, and the students need to complete it before they can continue. And in each lesson, we explain not only how it applies to the standards and the general concept being applied in class, but we also say how this specific lesson applies in the budgeting game itself so they can keep applying this concept again and again and again and do better in the game and get higher scores. So the higher scores in the game are tied back to the lessons, and the lessons are tied back to the standards, and so everything has a clear progression showing the students who are doing the best in the budget game at the top of the rankings. You can have a very straightforward class discussion. They'll say exactly why they are, and then that will lead directly into the stuff that you're supposed to be covering in class to begin with. Our stock game is the other side. We bring the business and economics news to life. We have a ton of research tools, income statements, balance sheets, cash flow statements, everything in between. The class rankings, like I said with the Wall Street Survivor game, are the biggest engagement driver in the stock game. The students like to see how their portfolio is doing compared to everybody else in the class. And it's an awesome launching point for class discussion. But the extra bonuses we have here is that teachers can add bonus cash to their students' portfolios. They can use it they can give the students extra cash as a reward for in-class activities. They can take other activities that were short-term and give students bonus cash to their portfolios based on how they did, which means that you can take a short-term activity like some other assignment or other game that you're participating in, and carry it over to a longer term impact, because it will now impact their portfolio because you're giving them cash based on how they did on those other formative assessments. So one example of this is a teacher had their students doing short quizzes and lessons in their classes, and then the students were getting bonus cash in their stock game based on the scores they got on those quizzes. So the quizzes themselves were not for a grade, and the stock game portfolio ranking is not for a grade. But the whole point was, because students' class rankings, and they can see it persistently, keep building up. They see that these quizzes apply to the stock game, which applies to their class ranking, which is a long-term assignment, which then leads into how they're going to talk about it in their final reports and things. The whole point is, every time the students are making an action, they see how it relates to the other stuff they're working on, and they see how all of that together relates to the overall objectives of the class. On both ends, regardless of what game that we have, we also have a huge curriculum library. Over 300 lessons in accounting, management, marketing, personal finance, economics, etc. Teachers on our platform set up customized assignments where they grab lessons and they have their students complete these lessons while they are working on the stock game or the budgeting game. So in a typical class session, a teacher would have the students spend 15 minutes on the budgeting game, 15 minutes on the stock game, and 15 minutes on some of the assignments that we added in. So they'd probably do 2 or 3 lessons in one sitting. This is what it looks like. Where the one thing that we make sure we do is we give those students a progress bar, where the progress bar fills up as the students complete the tasks that the teacher assigned for them. The objectives are crystal clear, the progression is crystal clear, and the teachers assign rewards to each assignment. So by completing all these lessons my teacher asked me to do, I get extra cash into my stock game or my budget game as the teacher sees fit. So there's a tangible reward that students get for completing everything on time, and then the teachers have tangible sense of how the students are doing, because these all end with pop quizzes and assessments that the teachers can see at each student's progress. So all of it, again, the whole point is you take the little stuff, it has to build directly into the big stuff. The students have to see that connection. The big stuff builds up to the generalized class objectives. And the longer term you can do that, the better. The more you can show the little stuff applying to the big stuff, the better the gamification works in the classroom. The more engagement you get, and the more students learn out of it. The last one is badges. So I talked about badges as being one of the points of failure in our old Wall Street Survivor website. That's not the case in the new one. We're adding in badges again, but this time there's a couple important differences. First, the badges are earned by completing activities directly related to these classes. So by completing certain milestones in the budgeting game, the student gets another badge, which then serves as a reminder that they have completed a certain milestone. It's something they were doing already. It's in line with the goals they had for the class, and they're getting a signification showing that they're making progress. Same thing with a lot of the curriculum. Completing certain combinations of lessons earns badges. Completing certain actions in the budgeting game earns badges. There's over 100 different badges that students can earn different ways. Students can show off their badges on the ranking page is another really important one. So the students choose which badge they want to show, and if you click on a student's badge, it'll show you all the other badges they've earned. So, the idea here is that a lot of students are going to have badges that other students don't, and we want to get a little bit of a sense of jealousy. Even if you're not at the top of the class rankings, you could still try to have the coolest and rarest badges that are hard to get. Looking for lessons that aren't necessarily even something the teacher has the students do yet, going the extra mile to find those kinds of things. That's the kind of stuff that we're trying to encourage, that real exploration. And every little step is building to something bigger. There's, you'll get a beginner, intermediate, and expert levels of badges, so they can really show that they're making progress for each level of things that they're doing. Some of the other stuff that we're working on, which I'm hoping to have done by the end of the summer into the fall semester, we're doing 2 new modes for our budgeting game. The first one's called a full-time mode, where instead of a student with a part-time job, it's an individual with a full-time job. That one's going to be working a little bit. There's lessons in there for professional development and a lot more types of bills and things. We're also developing a small business mode of our budgeting game, which is a little bit more applicable to the business classes, because instead of a person managing their personal budget and cash flow, it's a small business managing their cash flow and business growth. So instead of setting a personal budget, they set a business budget, and the events in the game, instead of impacting their personal budget, it's things that would impact a business and the business's cash flow. So that one's going to be a very major overhaul that we're hoping to launch in the fall, probably to a small test group of teachers for feedback first, and then probably a wide rollout for the spring of next year. In the stock game, we're rolling out weekly deposits. So instead of giving your students $10,000 or $100,000, you would be able to set them up with $1,000, and then every week of the game they would be depositing extra cash into their accounts, which then they need to start reinvesting. So it's more like a real retirement account, but the main thing is they have more collateral they can use to continually reinvest as the semester goes on to, again, drive that engagement. We have widgets and things already that let you broadcast your stock game rankings to the classroom, which is another huge bonus for engagement. But we're adding more of them. We're adding more widgets and more stuff to make your students see how they're doing relative to the rest of the class for the entire duration of the class. Which again, it's that kind of status symbol that you're trying to push the students into. So that basically concludes the long lecture series that I wanted to get out of the way. Other stuff I do want to say that we have is lesson plans. Our lesson plans basically show you a bunch of stuff that we have available, and the teachers can put them together and mix them and match as they see fit in order to use it for their class. There's my email if you have questions, and we have a demo class set up if there's any teachers who want to try it out.
All right, Kevin, thank you. We had a couple questions coming in.
Great.
Would a small business be geared, would quote unquote small business be geared for maybe accounting or entrepreneurship classes? Our students love the stock game, by the way.
Great. So the small business mode is being geared towards general business, like an introduction to business at first, but the actual lessons and little events that happen in the game are going to be highly customizable. So there's going to be a bunch of stuff for accounting classes that can be turned on or off. There's going to be a bunch of stuff for entrepreneurship classes that can be turned on or off. And you can mix and match things as the class goes on to focus on one thing or another. I don't have a demo to show you of that yet. I just have our concept stuff, which is kind of a mess. But it's something that we've been working on for the last 2 years, and we're finally actually executing it pretty much starting next month.
All right. She says, thank you. That was from Carrie Largo. All right. So we're online today with Kevin from Personal Finance Lab. He's been talking about business simulations and the different methodologies. I thought you did a great job going into some of the details of the thought that goes into gamification. And looking right now for any additional questions for Kevin. We have had about 55 at our high point today, and we're happy about that. Does the stock game, this is from Eric Swansberg from Massachusetts. Kevin, he asked, how does the stock game work? And can you provide an overview? Are students allowed risky trading practices like short selling?
Let me pull it up, actually. That might be the easiest way. Oops, I don't need that. So the stock game, I'm going to very quickly look at the teacher settings here.
While he's doing that, Carrie Largo says, we use the stock game in our finance class and have nothing but positive responses. Kevin is great to work with. Definitely recommend this product. So, there's some practical information while Kevin navigates to the stock game.
So in the stock game, there's over 60 different settings the teachers can set up. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see it a bit better. The currency, probably US, but there's a ton of them in there. The dates, how much cash you give the students to start with. In terms of can the students use risky investments, that's up to you. You can turn day trading on or off. You can put short selling on or off. You can put a minimum stock price for what students can buy. We recommend a $5 price because we don't like penny stocks, but some teachers like it because some students are interested in it. Can the students see each other's trades? Because you can have it public or private. do you want, as the teacher, want to be in the rankings? And I will say classrooms where the teacher is trading and is in the rankings get about a 30% higher engagement because the students want to beat the teacher. What can the students trade? Stocks, ETFs, mutual funds, bonds, even options and stuff. Some of our other rules saying how much can the students invest in any single stock. So, for example, a 20% position limit says you need at least 5 stocks to use up your cash. You can only put 20% of your portfolio in one single thing. And even diversification rules. 50% of diversification rule says I can only put half my portfolio in stocks. The rest has to be divided between mutual funds and bonds, and they can do that however they want to. So there's a lot of different granularity you can play around with. The default settings we set for everything is a pretty, run-of-the-mill classroom, but you can do more or less depending on how you want to talk about investing for your class. One of the other things that we do is trading notes, so the students have to write why they're doing every single trade, and the teachers can review that later too. So great for doing reports, great for you doing some formative assessments, great for you just following with the students, that making sure they're not doing things in a random order.
Barbara Hagler says, I want to go back to school to play these games. I'm with you, Barbara. I don't know where these games were. When I think the Apple IIe wouldn't quite handle these games when I was in school. And that was when I was a senior, I think. Anyway, appreciate the demo. Thank you from Eric Swansberg, who asked for that demo. And so any other final questions for Kevin? We have a lot of potential users of this product I know on here. All right, so I think, Kevin, that's about it for now. I think you have your email address up there if others want some additional information.
Sure.
But we really appreciate you. Is there anything else you'd like to share today?
Yeah, so I have this link here, content.personalfinancelab.com/NBA-demo. This would give teachers a demo student account of Personal Finance Lab with literally everything turned on, so you can just see all the different parts of it. And
if you'd like to share that in the chat, that'd be great.
How do I do that? Let me see here.
On your little control, yeah, you probably know. Doesn't look like you need help with the technology.
Actually, I can't find my little chat box. I had
it's
it up
buried
here.
under there somewhere. Probably if you go down to your taskbar and click the Zoom icon, it'll pop back up there to the...
Yeah, I have it on another monitor.
When you're sharing your screen, it's hard to find the chat. If you
Oh,
share
yeah,
your
okay.
screen, it's easier.
Here we are.
There we go. So content.personalfinancelab.com/NBA-demo.
And we are doing a thing specifically because all the schools are shut down right now. We're doing a free challenge that starts Monday and goes through May 8th. You can sign up your class for that. Your class would get everything, and it's completely free. So I would recommend you just checking that out. If you need an extra activity you want to give your students for the end of the semester, sign right up. It's super easy. So this one doesn't have the same level of control that you would have if you were using the full Personal Finance Lab, because you don't get to set your class rules, you don't get to pick the assignments, you don't get to pick the settings for the budgeting game, but it has everything turned on and you can try it out and see for yourself how you like it.
All right. Excellent.
So if there's no other questions, I will stop sharing my screen.
All right. Well, thank you again, Kevin. That'll conclude our session here today with Kevin. We appreciate him, his perspectives, and showing us around what's possible with Personal Finance Labs. Well, we have some exciting times just ahead. We're going to take a nice little break here till about an hour and 20 minutes from now.